I'm going to ask the team to introduce themselves. It's, I think, 5 or 6 folks involved with this. So well, there are 3 names there. So
Yeah, so these are the 3 who are presenting, and then we have 2 more who helped, who were like main authors on the white paper.
so Fenya, I understand you're an undergraduate
Mhm.
at Cornell. Are you in the engineering school or?
Yeah, environmental engineering.
Yeah, great. And Tony and Jacob, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Tony Ingraffia, a long retired former professor at Cornell in civil and environmental engineering.
Great to have you with us, Tony. It's
Always
been
great
too
to be
long.
with all of you. Thank you.
And Jacob.
Yep, I'm Jacob Mays. I'm an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering, so the same department as Tony. And thanks to all of you for joining.
Okay, great. Well, Fenya, why don't you take us into the presentation?
All right, so this is a presentation on a white paper on estimating the operational emissions of Cornell University heat decarbonization pathways. And so these are the other 2 who worked mainly on the white paper but won't be presenting. Should they present themselves too, or should I?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm a research scientist. I actually live in Ithaca, but working from the University of Cornell and Champaign Institute for Sustainability over there.
And Bethany.
Yeah, I'm Bethany Euler-Tomays. I have a PhD in environmental decision making and was glad to collaborate on this project. Also live here in Ithaca.
And then, of course, Margaret Caslin and Brian Eden, who we're all very familiar with, were working group members as well. So a very esteemed team working on this project. So Fenya, take it away.
All right, so I'm going to start with some background on the Ithaca Energy Code Supplement. So this became law in 2021, and this is part of the Ithaca Green New Deal, which is Ithaca's climate justice policy. So you've probably heard of the Ithaca Green New Deal. It was driven by climate justice organizations like Sunrise Ithaca, and there are 2 main goals. So one, to achieve community-wide carbon neutrality by 2030, as well as to ensure that the benefits are shared among all local communities to reduce historic, social, and economic inequities. So within this context, the Ithaca Energy Code Supplement seeks to deliver measurable and immediate reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from new buildings, major renovations, and new additions. And in order to work towards this goal, it requires that all new construction and significant renovations should phase out fossil fuel use beginning in 2026.
So I've been asked to brief you all on a very important, crucially important heat decarbonization project ongoing at Cornell University. It's called Earth Source Heat. So I'm going to briefly describe what it is and then tell you what the current status of the project is. Why me? Since its inception, I have been an advisor to this project because of my expertise in drilling wells and in fracking. So what is the project? As you can see from this diagram, the idea is to obtain hot water by mining heat from rock more than 2 miles beneath the campus. The idea is to use that hot water to heat the buildings on the campus. And this is different than the other form of geothermal energy that you're probably all familiar with. Some of you probably have ground source heat pumps. Same idea, get heat from the earth, but this is an entirely different animal. Yeah, the objective, of course, with the idea of decarbonizing is to replace the steam and the hot water that's currently coming from the Cornell natural gas burning combined heat and power plant that we know as CHP. So in essence, the idea behind Earth Source Heat is to drill a set of wells, a pair of wells. In this diagram, the blue well is taking cold water from the surface down into the hot rock. That cold water then circulates through the hot rock by way of fractures that are created by fracking, finds its way into the red well and comes back to the surface as hot water. It goes into a heat exchanger and then goes into the extant Cornell pipeline system, which brings steam and hot water into all the buildings on campus. That's the idea. Next slide, please, Fenya. Earth source heat is Plan A for the campus. The idea is to have that project completed by 2035 so as to reach Cornell's stated objective of being net zero by 2035. And as you well know, the largest component of emissions from the campus is from the heat and power plant. This was all emphasized recently when the interim president wrote an op-ed. I'm quoting from it: "In the long term, the most promising way for us to meet our energy goals is earth source heat. It is a game-changing technology. I'm committed to it, with the potential to meet cold climate heating needs with less electricity than other options." That's the rub that we're going to be talking about for the rest of this talk, whether it does, in fact, preclude the immediate use of other options for decarbonizing. I want to emphasize that earth source heat is still experimental. It's in its research phase. It's a no guarantee experiment. It has only been replicated a few times around the world, most recently in the Western United States. It's never been shown to work in the eastern part of the United States. Next slide, please. The first major step after 7 or 8 years of study for earth source heat was to drill a vertical borehole that happened in the summer of 2022 to obtain critical data from downhole. That hole went almost 2 miles deep. It cost over $10 million. The next step that we're waiting on right now is to re-enter that original vertical borehole and gather more data so that we de-risk earth source heat. There's still many questions that need to be answered. We can reduce the risk by getting more data out of that existing hole, which we call the Cornell University Borehole Observatory, CUBO. We're currently waiting on a grant, a large grant from the U.S. Department of Energy to fund that step, re-entering CUBO. It's important to realize the scope of this project. Huge in terms of impact, footprint, and cost. If it's going to provide upwards of 95% of all the campus heating needs, it will require multiple pairs of wells, not just a single pair as shown in that diagram, but multiple pairs. 3, 4, 5, 6, we don't know yet. Each of the wells in those well pairs will not be 2 miles long, they'll be upwards of 3 miles long. And fracking will be needed to connect the wells in each pair. So the key question for today is, what do we do in the meantime? If it's going to take to 2035 and scores of millions of dollars to get there, what do we do in the meantime to decrease emissions? And what happens if ESH, an experiment, fails? I'll hand over to Fenya to continue now.
I think this
Okay,
is,
but yeah, it's so on the next slide. Yep. Okay, so as Tony was just discussing, the kind of the starting point from this analysis is to say, okay, if we have earth source heat that if everything goes according to plan is sized to meet 95% of campus's heating demand, then the question is, okay, well, one question is, what do we do if that fails? And the most viable strategy there is to fall back on ground source heat pumps. And then the other observation here is that since the earth source heat is only going to be sized to 95% of total needs, it needs to be complemented by other injections of heat into the thermal energy network, into the district energy network. And so ground source heat pumps might be part of the solution there as well. So what we wanted to ask is, if ground source heat pumps are going to be part of that portfolio, meeting the heat demands in 2035 and going forward, at what point does it make sense to start installing them, and what would the emissions impacts be if we started installing them in 2026 in line with the IECS. So next slide, please. So I think the critical point of departure from previous presentations that you've heard from the energy team is on the point of how to estimate the emissions consequences of a long-term capital project like building electrification. And so this is an excerpt from an ICERTA document, just highlighting that for these types of long-term capital investment type decisions, we're interested in the long run emissions impacts. And so that means we ought to be using long run marginal emissions rates. So this is a point that I'm going to return to at the end of the presentation because I think it's a critical point of discussion as we make decisions about this going forward. So next slide, please. So a little bit on that distinction between short-run marginal emission rates and long-run marginal emission rates. So with a short-run marginal emission rate, which you may have heard about in previous presentations from the energy team, the idea is you have a small incremental change in electricity demand, and you want to know in the short run what is the consequence of that change in electricity demand. In New York, that incremental demand in the short run is typically met by a gas plant. So the emissions consequences are the emissions from that gas plant that's being used to create that electricity. In a long run model, you also account for the structural changes that are happening in the grid. So by increasing load in the system, you increase demand, you increase prices, at least in the short run. Investors respond to that by building new power plants. And then in principle, you have a slightly different resource mix. And so you want to take into account those structural changes when you calculate the consequences of a change in load. So in New York, as everywhere, it's complicated to estimate what those long-run marginal emissions rates might be because it's a combination of new wind and solar that's getting built, old gas plants that are staying online longer than they would have otherwise, imports which might be clean if they're from Quebec, they might be dirtier if they're from Pennsylvania, and so you try to model a kind of a blended average between all of those factors in trying to understand what the consequence of an increase in load from electrification would do. Next slide, please. So broadly speaking, just to kind of highlight this point that if we're trying to understand the real consequences of something, we ought to be using long run rates and not short run rates. This is just an excerpt from a recent paper from one of my collaborators, Jesse Jenkins at Princeton, and his co-authors. They were examining hydrogen production and not heating electrification, but similarly, it's a long-term capital investment. And I chose this title because it's particularly clear in saying you can't use short-run rates. It's a poor estimate of what the consequences of an electrification decision might be. Next slide. The other question that might be asked is, even though we can't use short-run rates, maybe short-run rates, you might consider them a good estimate of the long-run rates. And so I chose this other paper from some authors at NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, that basically establishes, it's not so simple as that. You can't just take a short-run rate and plug it in as your estimate for long-run rates. In this paper, they do that for a number of load cases, and they say, if you use the short-run rate, the SRMER, it overpredicts the emissions consequences relative to what actually plays out in their modeling. Next slide. So in the context of the IECS, the idea is here we want to deliver reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and we want to assess whether adding ground source heat pumps in the near term would accomplish that goal relative to the status quo. Status quo includes the implementation of earth source heat in 2035. And we're going to do that on the basis of estimated long-run emissions rates. And so that's the primary contrast with previous presentations. that I think happened in front of this group. So with that, I'll turn it back to Fenya.
So, as mentioned, the Ithaca Energy Code supplement requires fossil fuels to be phased out for new construction beginning in 2026, whereas earth source heat is not anticipated to come online. If it is successful, it is not targeted to come online until 2035. So this presents this question of how Cornell should provide heat to new construction in the meantime before earth source heat comes online. So to address this question, we consider a couple of different options for grid decarbonization. One is what we call delayed decarbonization, and Cornell has requested an amendment to the Ithaca Energy Code supplement, which would allow them to go with this option. So this would involve the continued use of the natural gas-fired combined heat and power plant from 2026 up until 2035, when earth source heat is assumed to come online to meet the heating needs of the building, or the buildings that we're considering. So that's shown by the first timeline here. And then the second timeline shows near-term decarbonization, which is required by the Ithaca Energy Code supplement in its current form. So for this, these construction projects would be paired with ground source heat pumps, which would help to meet the heating demand of the new building and reduce the use of the combined heat and power plant in the near term, while also supplementing earth source heat once it comes online. And then if earth source heat isn't successful, this would also be the alternative. So what we want to estimate here is the change in operational emissions for the duration of the study period, so 2026 through 2050, which would result from going with near term as opposed to delayed decarbonization. So in order to estimate this, we consider a few different major sources of emissions. One is the use of natural gas in the combined heat and power plant. So this leads to CO2 emissions, and then we also account for upstream methane emissions due to leakage throughout the natural gas supply chain. Then there's also the electricity required to power the alternative heating systems. So ground source heat pumps and earth source heat both require electricity to operate. This is assumed to come from the grid, where it may be generated by another emitting plant, such as a natural gas plant, and so there will be some emissions associated with this. A note here is that earth source heat is much more efficient compared to ground source heat pumps, so it requires less electricity to provide the same amount of heating, which is one of its big advantages. We also assume that the use of lake source cooling would be replaced with ground source heat pumps to meet the cooling demand of the building. And we assume that this would increase electricity requirements because ground source heat pumps are less efficient. However, it may be necessary to use these systems to provide both heating and cooling in order to maintain a seasonal energy balance, so due to operational constraints. However, we note that it may actually be beneficial to have ground source heat pumps to supplement lake source cooling for meeting the cooling needs. We also consider electricity co-production. So the combined heat and power plant produces both electricity and heat, so we need some way to allocate the emissions between these different sources. So our approach is to calculate the emissions from the natural gas, but then subtract the emissions that would be attributable to electricity, and these are assumed to displace electricity on the grid. So the implication is that we assume that when ground source heat pumps are installed, this reduces the heating produced by the plant. It also reduces electricity co-production, and that this will then need to be replaced by electricity from the grid, where it may again be generated by another emitting plant. Our illustrative test case considers the emissions impact of near-term versus delayed decarbonization for current construction projects ongoing at Cornell as of 2024. In particular, we consider 8 major new construction or renovation projects planned or underway at Cornell, and we note that these make up 4.48% of campus square footage. So as an illustrative assumption, we assume that they make up 4.48% of energy use for heating and chilled water. A note about the engineering feasibility, we assume that the buildings can remain on the district energy system, so retain some of the benefits such as the flexibility and resilience provided by the system, with the ground source heat pumps providing an additional infusion point into the system. So one important input into our calculations, as Jacob alluded to, is understanding the emissions of the New York State grid. So as mentioned, we use the long-run marginal emissions rates as is recommended for modeling of building electrification. The values given by NYSERDA assume the implementation of the New York Climate Act, or CLCPA, leading to a reduction in emissions. However, an important question here is what happens if we're actually falling behind on grid decarbonization goals. because unfortunately, there's been a lot of concern about whether we're actually going to meet those goals due to various concerns, such as less federal support and the increasing loads and so on. So we want to look at how this impacts our results. So in order to do this, we consider a few different grid decarbonization scenarios where we model different evolutions of the grid and consider how this impacts our findings. The CLCPA decarbonization scenario assumes emissions reductions consistent with the CLCPA targets, and this uses the emission factors from the E3 report produced by NYSERDA. And so these are assumed to fall to zero in 2040, in line with the carbon neutrality by 2040 goal. Then we have the delayed or CLCPA +3 decarbonization, where we assume that decarbonization does occur, but falls 3 years behind intended targets. So this is using the same factors as the CLCPA case, but 3 years delayed. Then for the no CLCPA decarbonization, we consider the long-run marginal emissions rates for PJM East, a nearby region which has weaker decarbonization policy. And these are the emissions rates modeled by NREL, and these remain positive through 2050, unlike the NYSERDA emissions, which are assuming that it falls to zero in 2040. So the question that we're trying to ask here is, what might be the long-run emissions impact of installing ground source heat pumps in 2026? So these are the results for our test case looking at new construction. The blue bar is showing delayed decarbonization with continued use of the combined heat and power plant until 2035, when earth source heat comes online. And then the orange bar is near-term decarbonization, which we consider the use of ground source heat pumps for basically the duration of the study period from 2026 until 2050. The dark blue bar is showing the net emissions attributable to heat after subtracting emissions from electricity co-production, and these are also shown as the light blue. So this is for the CLCPA decarbonization case, and so the orange bar is relatively small, and this makes sense because there's a lot of clean electricity available to power the ground source heat pumps for this scenario. From 2040 to 2050, there's no emissions associated with the grid electricity. So because of this, we see a huge reduction in emissions, around 90%. And then what happens when we're falling 3 years behind intended targets? So CLCPA +3 looks pretty similar. So a couple of changes. Firstly, the orange bar is increased. So that's basically dirtier electricity powering the ground source heat pumps that leads to more emissions. Also, the light blue negative bar, this has become more negative because Cornell basically gets more credit for electricity co-production if it's displacing electricity from a dirtier grid. And this is why the dark blue bar is decreased. The actual emissions from the natural gas have not changed, but we're subtracting more from when we have a dirtier grid because of the way that we account for electricity co-production. And so this is around an 86% reduction, so it's pretty similar to what it was for the CLCPA decarbonization case. And then when we have the no CLCPA decarbonization, for this, we have a smaller reduction, closer to 50%. However, there still is a reduction in emissions. So based on our analysis, it does seem to be beneficial to install ground source heat pumps across all these cases, even when the CLCPA goals are not being met. Ground source heat pumps still make sense from an emissions standpoint. So what happens to the benefits of ground source heat pumps as we approach the earth source heat target date? So we just looked at installation of ground source heat pumps in 2026, but now what happens if instead we look at installation in 2030? And again, we're here assuming that earth source heat comes online in 2035 and will meet the needs of the building. So this is the same as before, but now we're considering the installation of ground source heat pumps in 2030 rather than 2026. And what we see is a smaller but still significant reduction in emissions. So around 55% for the CLCPA scenario, 52% for CLCPA +3, and then 30% for the no CLCPA scenario. So it is still seem to be beneficial to install ground source heat pumps even in 2030, but we see diminishing benefits as we approach the earth source heat installation date. Okay.
Okay, so as we've been talking about, I think one of the, as you saw in those charts, one of the major influences here in how we assess the emissions consequences is the estimate of long run emissions rates. So does it look more like the PJM scenario without the policy support, or does it look like the CLCPA case? And that makes a huge difference from 90% to 50%. So next slide, please. So I thought it was worth talking a little bit more about the status of New York's grid decarbonization. And so I think on the left side, I have the good news, which is that if you look at all of the capacity being added to the grid in both nationwide and in New York, it's really overwhelmingly clean. So if you look at 2024, there was 62.8 gigawatts of new generation added to the grid US wide. And of that, 2.5 gigawatts was gas capacity. If you look more closely at the New York interconnection queue, there's currently two gas projects in the queue that out of about 80 gigawatts of projects all told. So overwhelmingly, what's being added to grids is clean. That could change a little bit with the new administration, but at the same time, project developers can't turn on a dime. I think it's reasonable to say that the new generation that's being added is a lot of it is clean. So that's the good side. The bad side, or the bad news from a decarbonization standpoint, is that the pace of those additions is still well below the targets of the CLCPA. And so in New York in particular, we have lots of challenges with siting and permitting and interconnection, et cetera. Supply chains have been an issue, especially for the offshore wind industry. And so it's certainly the case that we're behind the CLCPA numbers. So next slide. So I think where we stand here is that the New York projection, so these are the 90% reduction type results that we got, are certainly over optimistic. We also know, and this is kind of clear in the papers that I showed before, that using short run rates is too pessimistic. And so we use the PJM numbers as kind of a pessimistic case. But the point I want to emphasize here is that this is relevant not just for Cornell's analysis, but really for the IECS and really for decisions statewide. So the goal of NYSERDA putting together this report with estimates of long-run marginal emissions rates is so that people across the state could look at those and make decisions about electrification of their heating systems and their vehicle fleets, et cetera. And so there's a lot riding just beyond Cornell on the credibility of those estimates. Wait, can we stay on the previous slide for one more second? Anya? So I think it's important as we look at these forward-looking estimates that these are refreshed, taking into account new information annually or every 2 years or something like that, because really even estimates that were produced in 2022, we might not really consider still up to date at this point. So next slide. So I think that at a high level for decarbonization under the IECS to work, we need two things to happen. We need decarbonization of the electricity grid, and we need electrification of building heat. And those kind of need to happen in parallel. Just from a practical standpoint, you can't really wait until the grid is entirely decarbonized to start electrifying heat, because it takes a long time to do these capital projects. In our analysis, using the rates that are available in the published literature, we find a 54 to 92% emissions reduction, depending on the assumption around the long-run emissions rates. And these could certainly be refined if we had more detailed modeling like that, like the modeling that gets performed by the Cornell energy team that is much more specific on individual buildings' energy demands. But I think this critical input of long-run emissions rates is going to remain very important looking forward. So I already saw some things in the chat, but I'm also happy to take questions, and I think the rest of the team welcomes discussion on this.
Thanks, Jacob and Fenya and Tony. So this is a lot of information to absorb. And I encourage people to take another look at the white paper, having seen this presentation. I'd also like to ask Jacob if you could share the slides with me after the meeting. And Jeff, I forgot to ask you too, so I could get the slide decks out to the group when we get the link to the cloud recording, and I'll be sending all that out later today. But Jacob, if you were going to, in the grossest terms, you're at a cocktail party and with folks that have fairly short attention spans, and have other things on their minds, what's the message that you would deliver here to try to drive home the point you're making?
Well, this is slightly, I mean, obviously I said this in the context of the paper, but the point is that all of this does rely on decarbonizing the grid. And I may be biased because that's what I work on, but I think the continued attention to making sure that we actually accomplish that and is really where, to me, the emphasis needs to be. So I guess that's what I would try to convey, and that wasn't a particularly cocktail party type of response, but that's what I would.
Yeah, it's something that, in my experience, engineers have a hard time
guilty
getting that kind of non-technical communication across. But I appreciate your taking a stab at it. Bethany's raising a question about your mention of the Princeton campus, and I have been following that to some extent, but not in great detail, just enough to know that they're really moving very quickly on campus decarbonization projects. You want to talk about that a little more, Jacob?
Yeah. So well, I mentioned Princeton because Jesse, who I cited one of his papers earlier, is at Princeton, and as you mentioned, they've embarked on a project to use shallow geoexchange, or geothermal heat pumps across the campus. So the interesting observation there is that they are in PJM East. It's a much dirtier grid than New York, both on the margin and in average. And so I think, so I'm not sure specifically about the analysis that they made of consequential emissions when they made that decision, but they must have used a declining rate over time, because otherwise I don't think it would have supported that decarbonization project. So I just actually emailed Jesse to see if there's any more information on what type of analysis they did in terms of consequential emissions to support that effort.
Yeah, thanks. So if you do hear back from him, it would be good if you could share that information that I could get out to the group. So Bill Nowak, who is well known across the state for his work with building heat pumps, has a comment, great report, and then a question. Who makes the decisions on what Cornell will be doing regarding energy with forthcoming projects? And how will this report impact those decisions?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, there's some people on the call who are involved in those conversations. I think ultimately it's the Board of Trustees that makes those decisions. But it's I think to me, so as we know, Cornell is putting together their master energy plan, and I think a critical component into that plan is the view on long run marginal emissions rates. And so I would hope that that would become part of the thinking around about the consequences of decisions going forward.
There's a lot going on in chat, not surprisingly, but and I'm trying to keep up with it. Sarah Carson, who's with the energy and sustainability team at Cornell, does make the point that Princeton doesn't have lake source cooling. Do you want to just expand on that point, Sarah?
Sure. Yeah. That specific point, you know, is what it is on the surface, right? We have lake source cooling, which is many, many times more efficient than, you know, even our best ground source heat pump. So that makes the situation for Cornell different. And I think that's a key point, that there are unique circumstances for every user, every campus, and, our position in the grid, the resources that we have. And so the analysis for Cornell, as Jacob pointed out, is dependent on the particulars of our system and those efficiencies and, what's happening in the larger grid context. And we've, since the paper came out, had a few discussions with the authors. I have a specific question back at you, and then a couple more comments to offer as long as I've got the mic here. So we talked about the fact that cooling was left out of your initial results.
Mhm.
And I noted in your comments that you said it was included, but the numbers that you presented haven't changed. So that's just to say, I think if we took the time to ensure that your analysis, which I think was a great project and offers some interesting perspective, actually has the real campus data and it includes all of the energy uses. So not only the heat, which you've isolated here, but also the cooling, also the building plug load electrical use, that the numbers are going to change a little bit. I think that fundamentally, we agree, and we've said as much, that a portfolio of solutions is going to make sense. We've talked about shallow geo exchange, which is sort of the district energy system level of what you think about as a ground source heat pump for your home, probably makes sense. But it's a matter of, really understanding that doing that right now is going to have actually an immediate negative impact for the environment that doesn't show up in the numbers you showed us today, but I think Jacob might agree with that. And we would agree that at some point in the future, that's going to change, right? It'll go through a period of using more energy than our super efficient system with lake source cooling uses now, to a point where it'll be neutral, and then into the future where it'll be a good thing, right? But increasing emissions in the short term is not a good thing, right? And you looked at maybe 4% of our campus, right? And a whole transition, a whole campus transition, is going to be a really bad thing until we get to that neutral point, right? And even if you look at the MER data that supported this analysis, and again, that's helpful, and we completely agree that what's happening in the future is really important. That data is already out of date. It's only 2 years old, and it's already like 25% off. The clean energy standard has changed. There's not this linear model anymore. The utilities only have to buy what's available. So I completely also agree that focusing on decarbonizing the grid is really important. We're doing that as well to the best of our ability, but we don't want to make things worse today by moving out on a solution based on a model that is important and needs improvement, but doesn't match up to what we're seeing as common sense. So we would love to continue to collaborate and improve those models and improve those estimates, but we really need to understand and make sure that we're not doing harm in the interim. And happy to come back, talk more, give a presentation, answer questions about what we're doing in the meantime around our steam to hot water conversion, building more renewables on the grid, trying to make our buildings more efficient, trying to make lake source cooling even more efficient and more productive. You know, those are all things that we're doing as we're, you know, getting ready to, you know, continue the studies that our source heat has presented. We're looking at sewer heat recovery. You know, we're trying to do things in the meantime that make things better. And we're really trying to avoid doing things in the meantime that make things worse.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think it would be great if we could have you back when you have additional information to share about the efforts you just mentioned. Jacob, do you want to say anything more about how you took into account the effects of lake source cooling?
Yeah, so thanks, Sarah. And I think that Sarah, I'm in agreement with a lot of what Sarah just said, because ours is very much a top-down model, and in support of any individual building's decision, I think you would need a lot more precision on the engineering feasibility and the details of that building's requirements. And thanks to their input on lake source cooling, we did make an adjustment after the fact, after that last conversation, to penalize essentially the ground source heat pumps for having to use additional electricity. I think there's two reasons why it didn't make that big of a difference. One is that we used a seasonal coefficient of performance for ground source heat pumps for cooling of 7, which is taken from a previous Cornell presentation, which is actually pretty good. And then second, because the electricity, according to the long run marginal emissions rates, is not that dirty, and so it doesn't make as big of an impact into the overall numbers as the displaced gas consumption. So I see a lot of hands, so I think I'll end it there. But I'm looking forward to the ongoing conversations with the energy team about how to think about long run marginal emissions rates.
Thanks. A lot of hands up here, so I'm going to try to get everybody included. Tony, you have your hand up.
I did, but I just typed in my comment, so
Okay.
I'll just summarize it that if we take the current short-run marginal emission rate attitude, it means that you, me, and anybody who adds a ground source heat pump is increasing emissions. That negates the whole concept of IECS. And I don't think Nick at Park wants to hear that, because people are applying for grants and loans to add ground source heat pumps. And if we use only the short run marginal emission rate, it negates any of these supposed wonderful things we're doing to address climate change, for as long as we believe that. And the question is, how long should we believe that? When will we finally say, now is the time to do what we all want to do? Enough said.
Thanks, Tony. Ben, do you want to add to that? You've got a comment in chat.
Yeah, I was just saying that we're not advocating for converting the entire campus to ground source heat pumps. This analysis is focused more on new construction, because I think Sarah might have said something that mentioned that also, in terms of lake source cooling, I think there's been some confusion. I think we should definitely compare notes on this, but there was, in a previous TCCPI presentation, it said that ground source heat pumps are being considered to supplement lake source cooling anyway. So that's another thing to consider.
Yeah, thanks. Tony, I'm assuming that your hand is up, just left over. Unless you want to add something else. Bob, you've got your hand up as well. It's been up for a while.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you to all the presenters here. It's a complicated topic, but I think they did a really great job of summarizing it. And I also congratulate them on having written in the report. I think this really deserves a huge amount of attention. A technical question. I noticed in the report that you are using global warming potential 20, which is great because, of course, that's, I think, the appropriate for any analysis, but it's also what's required under the New York CLCPA. Cornell, of course, is not using GWP 20, despite the law. They're using GWP 100 in their calculations, and I just wonder if you can comment on how that affects your conclusions, if at all. Thank you.
I have to find it. We do have in the appendix something about, oh yeah, here we are. Okay, so the overall finding is that there's still a reduction in emissions from the installation of ground source heat pumps using GWP 100 as well as using GWP 20, but especially the absolute benefit decreases because there's less weight being given to methane under this way of accounting. But I think this in itself doesn't explain the difference between our analyses because we still see benefits from ground source heat pumps.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that.
Wayne, you want to join the conversation here?
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks for the presentation, and thanks for all the hard work and the good intentions that it represents. I think there are some really important nuances and maybe some commentary. In Jacob's presentation, he talked about the cleanliness of the new interconnects happening on the grid. And I think he talked about 68 gigawatts of new connection, of which the overwhelming majority was clean. I don't think it's helpful to talk about Texan and Utah and Nevada and interconnects, which are predominantly solar and geothermal, because they're not available to us in upstate New York, and they have no impact on the carbon emissions and the methane emissions associated with new interconnections here. Here in New York, the amount of scheduled new loads that the New York ISO is planning for vastly outstrip the amount of clean generation coming. And there's a lot of conversation about short run and long run emission rates and what's the appropriate place to set our fulcrum as we try and pivot and do the right thing for the future. We know what the short run emission rate is. We know what the impact is of making a change today. And if that impact is negative, and if we embrace the idea that today is when we have to act, today is the most important day in which we respond to the climate crisis, then I would humbly suggest we not do the wrong thing today. Now, aside from the fact that the team who's charged with modeling and understanding and providing for the energy demand of this campus, aside from the fact that this team actually comes up with very different estimates of how much energy it takes to heat and cool the buildings on this campus, the reality is that this team is trying to find out when we can make the change without making it worse. If we had a surgeon who was removing limbs because it was believed that at some point in the future, maybe 10 years down the road, a medical technology would exist to make that limb grow back even better, we would say you're crazy. But we are being told that we should be increasing short-term emissions, even though I think everybody in this community understands and agrees that there is no more critical time than right now to not make it worse. We're being told to make it worse because we believe at some point in the future it will be better. And I would humbly suggest this isn't the right path. Is converting to an electrified heating and distribution system the right path? Absolutely it is. Today is not the time to do it. It's time to do it when we can do it and reduce emissions. If we do it today, we increase the need for gas-fired infrastructure to be maintained on the grid to meet our load. Tony and I have discussed about whether we need to have faith and hope that things are going to get better. I believe things are going to get better, but my job is to not make it worse first. That's all.
Thanks, Wade. And I
Thanks.
think it's well taken, and I think the constraints on the supply chains and the deployment are very real. If we look at New York specifically, there's about 80 gigawatts currently in the queue. About 1.2 of that is gas. So I think it's less an issue of what is being deployed and more an issue of not enough is being deployed in my mind. I think that, and I put a couple papers the academic papers in there saying, using the short run estimate is not actually a good estimate of the consequences. I think that I am uncomfortable just rejecting the published numbers. I think the right approach from an academic standpoint would be to produce different numbers that tried to model the supply chain constraints better, that tried to model the interconnection constraints better. But I'm not comfortable just rejecting the estimates because I don't think the short run rate is a good estimate. So I think that's where I stand on how we evaluate the current consequences. I still lean towards believing that it makes things better based on, I don't believe it's 90%, but I also don't believe it's 0% or making things worse. And so to me, this really needs analysis at the level of rigor at which the original long run estimates were put together, but including these observations about the supply chain constraints and the interconnection and the permitting, et cetera, that are slowing down compared to what those models had.
More rigor is welcome. A really unwelcome piece of news that people on this call may not be aware of is that Saturday is the intended Trump tariff impact day for tariffs imposed on Canada, and Canada intends to reply by cutting off green power delivery. There won't be, in that case, abundant new hydropower flowing from the north. It'll be gas-fired power flowing from the south.
Dave, you've had your hand up for quite a while. We are running short on time here, and that's unfortunate because obviously a big discussion here and lots still going on in the chat that I hope people are paying attention to. The chat log, of course, will go out with the link to the recording. But David.
So I'll just comment on sort of two levels. One is that this is obviously a pretty complex topic, and even most of us here who are interested and involved in thinking about some of these issues, but not to the extent to which the researchers have done. I'm sure this is a little bit overwhelming for many people.
Well, my head is spinning. I can tell you that.
That's why you already said that.
In case you can't tell by the expression on my face.
Right. So I'm not gonna really comment on the Cornell specific part of it. Oh, and I also want to particularly thank Fenya as a student for having really, been involved in some really outstanding and important work in this kind of thing, and for doing a great job on presenting so much of it. I just want to briefly say, I'm a social scientist. I work with social science teams on deployment issues of large scale renewables. I want to underscore what Jacob said about, aside from what's going on campus, the big picture here is really about how quickly can we electrify on the one hand, and how quickly can we decarbonize the grid on the other, and to what extent, it's not just about Cornell, it's about what happens first. So this question of when do we do what is critically important, you know, and what issues do we look at? And, you know, I wish I could be more optimistic than I am, but there is a growing pushback against deployment. I look mostly at solar deployment, but, you know, there's a lot of political, but not just at the federal level, political considerations that we need to take into account about the acceptability of transformations of rural landscapes for the people that live there that have equity and other kinds of implications as well. And I'm not, you know, I look a lot at what's being proposed in the grid and particularly on the solar side. And I would be extremely surprised, as many other people have already said, if we're able to sort of meet state goals around this, particularly in the new federal environment. So I think we need to take that into account as we look at these things. And I'm glad to see that the researchers have looked at alternative decarbonization scenarios of the grid. But I think as a group, we need to really figure out how to advocate more effectively for electrification and decarbonization and integration, you know, and look at the implications of attempts to integrate the upstate grid, which we're part of now, with the downstate grid, which is where most of the dirtier electricity is being.
Yeah, exactly.
And there are equity implications related to that too, in terms of air quality. You know, it's a big, complicated issue. So.
Yeah, I wish we did have more time because this is such a rich topic and obviously highly energized, if not decarbonized discussion. But we do have to wrap up. For me, the really big picture here is the extent to which this discussion underscores the importance of paying attention to both what's going on the grid, as well as any efforts to electrify the buildings. So that's pretty basic, but that's my big takeaway. And I appreciate that the discussion has really underscored that. Again, there's a lot going on in chat. I will be sending the chat log out, but it's an interesting conversation there as well. And Brian, you had a quick
Yeah, I
share
think,
that.
yeah, I don't think this is an appropriate time because it's a much longer conversation than we have time for. But I
Yeah.
think it's a question we should examine soon, February, March, on what is the attack on decarbonization at the state level and how do we address it? And there's seriously underfunded. There's no dedicated funding for any of this climate action work that was proposed by the Climate Action Council. And we need to, and there's been quite a few setbacks lately. So we need to talk about how to reverse that.
Yeah, that's the other piece of this, right? Is it's not just what's going on with the grid or what's going on with individual buildings. It's also what's going on with policy at the state level, because the outlook there is not as hopeful as it might have appeared a couple of years ago. And some of that has to do with the reluctance of our governor to really push forward on the initiatives that would help us meet the CLCPA targets. So that's unfortunate. And that's why I really want to make clear to folks that it's very important to be involved with the discussions going on at the state level. And again, remind you that TCCPI is part of the New York Renews Coalition, as well as the Renewable Heat Now campaign, as well as the Climate Can't Wait. And we've been supporting the various policy changes that need to take place there, including Assemblymember Anna Kellis's GAP Fund Act, among others. And so, you know, I'm sharing information by email about some of that some of that work and policy push that needs to take place. So I hope people will pay attention to that and any other discussions that you happen to be part of, because we can all weigh in. And I think we've shown in the past, for example, getting the governor finally to sign the Climate Change Superfund Act. We've already demonstrated that we have the grassroots power to influence decisions at the state level. So I think it's incumbent upon each of us to get involved individually with that effort. Rebecca, you have your hand up.
Yeah, this is unrelated to any of the presentations, but on Tuesday, I believe this is a plug for the county case board. On Tuesday, there's a resolution being presented to urge Congress to keep intact the direct pay incentives for tax exempt organizations. Goes to the House Ways and Means Committee. So if you are interested in supporting and trying to ensure that the county passes that resolution and sends it on to the various stakeholders that ultimately frame the tax incentives, be great to see you there.
Thanks, Rebecca. That's also an important point, that we need to pay attention to the opportunities to influence federal policy as well. So many thanks to all of you for this great discussion today, but especially Fenya and Tony and Jacob for presenting the presentation on your white paper, and to the folks from the Cornell Energy and Sustainability team for participating in this discussion in what I think is a very constructive way. And I personally would love to see that conversation continue with that and collaboration. And Sarah, I can, we have pretty full agenda for meetings going forward, but I could juggle things if coming back in March would make sense.
Seems like that would be a good idea.
Okay, great. So I'll put you down for March then, and be in touch closer to the date. So thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon. No need to say stay warm, because it's already warm out there. But take care this weekend, and look forward to seeing you all back next month. Until then, bye for now.